Hello and welcome to Hazy Regulations, Cannabis and the Environment. My name is Chandler Randall and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it truly is such an honor to have you join us for this special program. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send us your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to take a moment just to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today for this webinar. And while they will be introduced very briefly, their full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I strongly encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's panel in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we have John Kagia. John is Chief Knowledge Officer at New Frontier Data. He is a pioneering thought leader in the cannabis industry, where he has developed market-leading forecasts for the growth of the industry, uncovered groundbreaking insights into the cannabis consumer, and led the first of its kind analysis of global cannabis demand. Next up, we will have Caitlin Urso. Caitlin is an environmental consultant at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, as well as chair of the Energy and Environmental Committee of the Cannabis Regulators Association. She works to advance environmental sustainability in the cannabis and craft brewing industry. And last but certainly not least, we have Buzz Hines. Buzz is a partner at Farella, Braun, and Martell. Buzz has a wide array of practice area, including facility and project permitting, regulation of greenhouse gas emissions, product stewardship, as well as working with clients in the wine and cannabis industries, where he assists with facility expansions, acquisitions, and agricultural and related product issues. We are so thankful to have each of you here. And with that, I will turn things over to John to get us started. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Chandler. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm absolutely delighted to be sitting on this panel with our two esteemed co-panelists to discuss some of the trends, trajectories, implications, and opportunities for more thoughtful environmental and sustainability considerations in the emerging global cannabis industry. So my name is John Kagia, and I serve as the Chief Knowledge Officer at New Frontier Data. And for those of you who might not know us, New Frontier Data is a market research, business intelligence, and data analytics company exclusively focused on the global cannabis economy. And so leveraging that perspective, I'm going to share a couple of themes in my brief opening remarks here, some to contextualize why this conversation is so important right now, based on the current size and the growth trajectory of this industry, as well as some of the issues that we think are really salient to this market as we talk about the impact of cannabis on the environment and issues related to the sustainable growth of this market. So first, just by way of context, while North America has really led the emergence of legal cannabis as we know it, fully legal cannabis in terms of adult use being legal, it's been really incredible for us over the past 8 years has been watching this industry go from having barely a handful of countries around the world where cannabis was legal in any form to at this point having over 70 countries that have legalized and begun to regulate cannabis in some form. So whether that's low THC products, CBD, hemp, or fully medical and adult use. This is a really important point to us because as we look at the North American markets and the role that the North American markets are playing in how cannabis gets implemented around the world, it's critically important to understand that the US and Canada are going to play a really important role in shaping the emergence of the global cannabis industry. The practices adopted in North America are going to be replicated in many respects globally. And so critically important that we all understand that at the advent of this industry, at the advent of the legal version of this industry. The decisions being made today around sustainability, around resource efficiency, are really going to have global consequence. And so as an industry, cannabis is in a really unique position to be able to kind of build these regulations as the industry grows. There's a lot of other sectors where these are kind of major changes that are having to be applied retrospectively into well-established markets. And so cannabis is in a unique position to be able to adopt these best practices early in the growth of the industry. And it would be truly unfortunate if we looked back a decade from now and realized that we'd missed an opportunity to get it right out of the gate, particularly when there's so many markets that we can learn from as this industry grows. There's also an issue of scale. Based on our modeling, in 2021, the global cannabis industry is going to be roughly $30 billion. By 2025, the legal market is going to be about $51 billion. But the total cannabis economy is already a $500 billion market. There's a tremendous amount of demand for cannabis in the world today. And so there's two important points there. If cannabis is already nearly a $500 billion industry, it means there's already a lot of cannabis being grown around the world. A lot of it is being grown without a lot of consideration for the environment and its impact on the environment in the places where it's being grown. But the goal of legalization is not to create a new market out of thin air, but to transition this very large existing market into a formal regulated structure. And therein lies the opportunity. We've seen it done in the US, we've seen it done in Canada, but we barely scratched the tip of the iceberg when we think about this in the global context. And that transition from a $50 billion legal market that will slowly cannibalize the existing $500 billion opportunity, we think is why it's so important for us to be having a robust conversation about resource efficiency and sustainability right now. In the US alone, this year we're looking at an industry that will do about $32 billion in sales. But by 2030, by the end of this decade, the US market alone could be driving over $70 billion in revenue annually. Between 2020 and 2030, in total, cumulatively, in total sales, the US will have generated nearly $500 billion in revenue. So, there's a lot of money to be made in this space. And I don't mean to position this as a capitalistic issue, but it's critically important to understand that part of the reason why making these thoughtful decisions about the growth of this market, why it's so important, is because of how much potential revenue is at stake in this market. We can talk about some of the resource constraints that operators in this market are facing, particularly given the sometimes crazy regulations that cannabis business operators have to face. But bottom line is there's a phenomenal amount of consumer demand for this product. However one might feel about it, that is the reality. And as this industry grows, there's going to be increasing pressure for the industry to be a good steward of the resources that it is using as the industry approaches maturity. Also worth noting that even as we're talking about $72 billion by 2030, that's still not going to be close to a fully mature market. So by 2030, our estimates for the total opportunity in the US is well over $100 billion. So even beyond 2030, there'll still be room for upside legal market growth in the US and certainly globally. So with that context, big, fast-growing industry that is evolving really quickly. There's a few aspects related to the environmental issues this industry is facing that I'd like to call out. One, I think, is just the quickening urgency being promulgated by climate change, and particularly in areas like water use. So we've been paying very close attention to the US drought monitor over the past 8 years, and it's been quite stunning to see how particularly the Western states, our country's most productive cannabis producing regions, how they're being impacted by drought conditions and the impact that that has on water access, cost of water, etc. So, on the bar chart here on the right, you can see that our 7 Western states, our most productive states, have all experienced pretty acute drought conditions in 2021. So Nevada at 70%, California at 67%, Arizona at 56%. And this isn't going to get better. And so for the producers in this market, we've been saying for a while that, one can bury one's heads in the sand, but at some point, whether it is from drought conditions because your water bills are going through the roof, whether it's drought conditions that are stimulating wildfires, you cannot escape the realities of what a drying Western US is going to have on the country's most productive producing regions. And that alone should be propulsive in our thinking around how to improve water efficiency. Now, in that context, over 60% of California facing drought, cannabis was being blamed for the drought shortages in the state. And we did an interesting collaboration with the Resource Innovation Institute, an organization out of Oregon that monitors resource use. And we've done 2 thought pieces with them, a report on water use in cannabis and one on energy use in cannabis. And going into it, we knew that the California's cannabis industry was under intense pressure for being blamed for the water challenges that the rest of California's ag economy was facing. And so, we were mapping how the average California operation was using water. And you see this cyclicality. The line chart on the left shows that you see this rise in a pretty significant rise in water use as you're going to the late summer months, and then it falls off as you go into the end of the year. And it's that water use that peaks in late summer, early fall, at the time that drought tends to be at its peak, that was part of the reason why cannabis producers were getting blamed for this water shortage. And it was an easy finger to point because it had never been quantified. We found that the average California grower is using about 180,000 gallons over the annual cycle of their production. And with this seasonal pattern being reflected across most types of grows. However, when we calculated how much the industry in total in California was using, how much water the state was using for cannabis versus other crops, it's actually quite stunning how little cannabis is using relative to the state's other major agricultural products. So lands and orchards are using nearly 7 million acre feet of applied water to their farms, which is a phenomenal amount of water. You have rice at nearly 5 million acre feet, land and vegetables at nearly 3 million acre feet. Cannabis is at 0.003 million acre feet. It is minuscule compared to these other crops, which is not to say there's not opportunities to increase the efficiency of water use. But to me, this was an excellent illustration of why it's so important to quantify the impact this industry is having. Because it's easy to point the blame when there aren't numbers to back it up. But based on our analysis against California being the largest producer of cannabis in the country, it actually, because cannabis is such a lucrative crop, you don't need to grow a lot of it for it to have a major economic impact. And there was, I think, a gross misunderstanding of how much cannabis is actually being produced to yield the revenues that it was yielding. And as a result, it was being blamed for water use that really is negligible relative to the state's water use. So this was to me just one of the exciting moments where we did not expect the variance to be so wide relative to the rest of the water use in the state. But it also underscored that cannabis is a major agricultural crop, but may not actually be having some of the impacts that it is being blamed for. Water is another, energy is another interesting aspect. And this one is a little more problematic for the industry because so much cannabis is being grown indoors. when you compare cannabis to some other major energy sinks in our economy, so it may not be as high as data centers, which are using 70 billion kilowatt hours per year, or medical centers at 57 billion 57 billion kilowatt hours per year. But at 4.2 billion kilowatt hours per year, this is, and growing, particularly growing on the legal side, you can't ignore that energy is a major source of or cannabis is a major source of energy use in our broader economy. And it is worth noting, however, when we did this analysis a couple of years back, certainly these numbers reflected an industry that was still transitioning from the old way in which cannabis was being produced. Very little investment in R&D, very little investment in innovation. And one of the things we have seen dramatically shift over the past 5 to 10 years in the cannabis industry is the massive investments being channeled to energy saving innovations. And this is happening in a few ways. One, you've seen this significant transition from purely indoor to mixed light environments. Two, you've seen the rise of LEDs, transitioning away from conventional lighting, high intensity discharge lighting. And that alone is saving 30 to 40% of the energy costs in these operations. You've seen installation of things like the beginning of use of things like solar energy. You've seen significant investment in data monitoring systems, closed environment cultivation facilities that allow the operator to both minimize their energy use, but ensure that energy is being directed into the places where it is needed and not being wasted in the places where it isn't. And so even as we see the demand for energy continue to grow, as this legal market grows, the focus on energy efficiency means that on average, on aggregate, newer facilities are using dramatically less energy than they were in 5 to 10 years ago. And that trend is only going to continue to continue. Perhaps one or two final points. One is around packaging, which I think is such an important part of the environmental impact of this industry. If you've ever been to a cannabis dispensary, you've seen what look like very large packages on the shelves. If you've ever taken packages home from the cannabis dispensary, you'll see that there's actually not very large products in those large packages. And so the amount of post-consumer waste being generated by this industry as brands try to create packaging that is visually resonant for consumers, as regulations require child safety packaging or labeling that require the packages to be larger because of the amount of information you have to put on it. All of this is leading to a lot of packaging whose only function is to get between the dispensary and the consumer's waste bin when they get home. And so this is a real conversation that the industry is going to have. It has begun. There's a lot of companies that are now looking at using 100% post-consumer waste, using hemp-developed packaging to try and reduce the environmental impact. But even as folks are trying to, in the industry, are trying to think of ways to make the waste more recyclable, less destructive, in terms of using new resources to create this packaging. This doesn't get addressed until the packaging requirements get better managed. So this is going to be a really important part of the conversation around sustainability, because as we go from being a $30 billion industry to a $70 or $100 billion industry, the volume of packaging that we're going to be dealing with is going to grow dramatically, and the industry is going to bear the responsibility for accounting for that. Similarly, we have been watching the the market for vaporizers, and particularly the market for disposable vaporizers, very, very carefully. And if there's one aspect of this industry that could prove to be the cannabis industry's equivalent of the Keurig K-cup problem, really efficient or elegant consumer solution that ends up driving massive amounts of waste, it's the vape sector, where the components are difficult to recycle. Consumers may not want to go through the burden of having to recycle these products. And so, this is an evolving conversation. Vapes now account for about 20% of sales in the market. So there's a lot of vaporizers being sold. The scale hasn't yet reached the point where it's become an ever-present constant in a disposal and trash kind of recycling ecosystem. But if we don't figure out a way to mitigate the environmental impact of vapes ending up in our trash waste streams without some form of reclamation and recycling, then I think in a decade or 2 decades, as this industry goes global, as vapes continue to become a really popular product, this could unfortunately end up being one of the areas where we will look back in retrospect and wish we had done more sooner. And then finally, since we think about cannabis holistically, we can't talk about cannabis without talking about the opportunities that we see on the industrial side of the plant. And for all of the big numbers I threw out at the beginning of this presentation, we actually think that the industrial hemp sector could prove to be an even larger opportunity than the THC based side of the economy. When I first started doing this work, we used to talk about, or I used to hear from folks on the hemp side that hemp is the most versatile crop in our agricultural economy. And I just thought they'd spent too much time in the hemp fields. But the more we've looked at this plant and its potential applications, the more we've seen opportunities to innovate some really sticky parts of our existing industrial economy. I have come to believe that this plant truly is one of the most versatile crops in our agricultural economy. And regulations and investment in innovation will be really critical to determining how many of these applications, from textiles to plastics to biofuels to papers to building materials, investment is going to determine how much of these applications come to realize industrial scale. But if we can achieve industrial commercial viability for hemp in these sectors, then we think as a highly sustainable replacement for fossil fuel based or other highly resource intensive materials in our economy, hemp poses real promise, and we're really excited to see what over the next decade the global cannabis innovators will be able to do with this plant. So if you're interested in the work we're doing, if you're interested in seeing some of the reports we've done, please visit newfrontierdata.com/analyst-reports. You can gain access to some of the reports I've referenced in this, as well as in my remarks here, as well as access to everything in our library. But I hope these brief remarks, they were somewhat brief, have helped frame our conversation today, and looking forward to hearing from Caitlin and Buzz and having a very rich conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, John. And with that, I will turn things over to Caitlin.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate you laying out all of that data to really help make sense of the industry scale and impacts. I thought that was a great graphic on water, where it's just this idea that it's so new and so economically impactful that sometimes that the environmental impacts are amplified or expected to be amplified as well. So I think that's great to be able to see the relative size and scale of things, and then also understand the growth that's coming with the industry. So I'm Caitlin Urso. I work for Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So I work for state government. My role is to be a free environmental consultant for small businesses in Colorado. So we define that as 100 employees or less. A lot of cannabis businesses fall under that definition. My role, typically how I work is I rotate through industries that I focus on providing proactive environmental assistance to. And so, 2016, 2017, I worked with the craft brewing industry. In 2018, I came to work with the cannabis industry through 2021 last year. This year, I'm shifting my focus to data centers. So I thought that graphic that John provided on energy intensity relative was quite timely for me because I went from working with cannabis businesses to now working with data centers, which data centers were pretty much or are pretty much the most intense building type. Spending 4 years with the cannabis industry, I really learned a lot, and I spent a lot of my time with it being such a new emerging industry, really trying to document what are the environmental impacts of this industry and what are the best management practices, regardless of the impact, can be applied to reduce the impacts. Basically, give businesses the tools to make improvements. And then a lot of my later work was really focused on helping government change regulation to be more environmentally friendly and support environmentally friendly practices for cannabis businesses. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat. That's the link to my program's environmental website. It's got a lot of external links that will help with cannabis sustainability. Just as you're along your journey, that's a great starting point. I was the author of the National Cannabis Industry Association's environmental report that was put out in 2020. If you need a starting point, that document is a great starting point for what are the environmental impacts, what are the best practices that can be applied, and then there's a little bit in there surrounding policy conversations as well. So that is linked on that website. I think it's one of the first links, but anyways, really great to be here and to talk to you guys today. As John pointed out, I think energy use is the main impact, especially here in Colorado, where we primarily grow in an indoor grow environment. Our regulations dictate that it's very hard to have an outdoor cultivation in Colorado. We don't have many greenhouses. We have some, but primarily it's indoor warehouses where we're fully synthetic environment, growing the cannabis crop, especially, marijuana. We also have hemp here. Hemp's typically grown outdoors, but marijuana is grown in these indoor warehouses. And really the energy load mostly is the HVAC system and the lighting and the competition between those two things. The typical lighting that is normally used within a cannabis facility, it's like 1,000 watts per light fixture, and there's many light fixtures in the room. So the electrical load going to power the lights is very high, but then those lights also generate quite a bit of heat. And then that heat has to be overcome with the HVAC system. And then when you add plants into that equation, under light and heat, plants transpire and you get a large humidity load. So your HVAC system is constantly fighting the load of your lights and the humidity of your plants. So a one-size-fits-all solution, which John mentioned, that I'll highlight even further to really have the biggest impact on your energy load at one of these facilities, is to switch to LED lights, because they have a twofold benefit. Not only are they bringing down the energy load per light fixture, because you're bringing down 1,000 watts maybe to about a 60 watt or even lower, depending on the sophistication of the LED light fixture that you're using. You don't get the heat profile from LED lights either. It's much lower. So your HVAC system isn't having to overcome that heat load. And then your plants are also not as transpiring as much because they're not under this constant heat. They're just under the load of the lights. You can also have less lighting waste with LEDs because you can get the lights a lot closer to the plants. You don't have to have them, much higher, and then you have all this lighting waste that's not actually hitting your plants because you had to have a gap before because of heat. The other advantage too with that lower heat profile is you can go vertical with your farm, with your cultivation. You can stack racks of plants With traditional lighting, your heat load would amplify every layer because heat rises. Well, if you don't have that amplified heat load going vertically, you can, with LEDs, you can really utilize your warehouse space a lot more efficiently, which will also lead to more efficient HVAC systems. So there's a lot that can be done in a cultivation to reduce that energy if you're willing to make that jump to LED lights. I feel like it's worth it. It's got the payoff. They're there. As far as energy regulation goes, there's not a lot of energy regulation specific to the cannabis industry. A couple of states have tried it, and have had various degrees of success with it. But essentially, there's two policy routes. You can either go the route of what I call observe and report, where you have cannabis cultivators report their energy usage, and then they have to have some sort of metric of improvement to reduce that energy usage. Or you can go what I believe is the easier policy route, but it is a little bit harder on industry, is if you have efficiency standards built into equipment. You have to have, the equivalent of LED lights within your facility, or an HVAC system that's XYZ efficient, essentially almost like green building codes that are industry specific. In Colorado, we have not broached the energy regulation side of the cannabis industry. We are more just on the side of encouraging energy efficiency and reduction, as in a cultivation, that's the number one input commodity into their process. It's the number one business cost of cultivation is that energy. So there is both economic and environmental drivers to get that energy use down. So I think that's everything I want to say on energy. So water, again, in an indoor cultivation environment, we are relying on the municipal drinking water supply to irrigate those crops and grow those crops. And then we're also relying on the municipal wastewater effluent. Essentially, it's going to our municipal wastewater treatment plants. That's the runoff. That's what's going out, versus outdoors in California, where you're having a more traditional irrigation agricultural setup where you're dealing with maybe erosion and runoff. So we have the benefit of being in this enclosed municipal system, but the downside of that, again, is energy. It takes a lot of energy to treat water up to municipal drinking water standards and move it through the pipes of the city to have it feed an agricultural crop. And then same thing with the wastewater effluent. It's essentially agricultural runoff that's going to our wastewater treatment plants. Our treatment plants are perfectly designed to take these types of loads. So it's not a matter of, can the wastewater treatment system handle it? Yes, they can. They're specifically designed for these types of nutrients, magnesium, nitrogen, phosphorus. These are all abundant in our traditional natural water supplies. So our treatment systems that are in place are well designed to handle the loads. It's more just the fact of they're using all of that energy to treat this agricultural runoff. So again, it kind of comes back to energy when you're in this enclosed system. The quantity of water is not extremely high. We encourage businesses to do like automated drip irrigation and not overwater. Sometimes it can be the practice to overwater by like over 50%, and then but you're also wasting nutrients that you just put into that water to feed your plants, which are also an expensive commodity. So we are seeing more advanced systems doing closed loop water recycling, where they treat the water post feeding it to the plants and then bring it back to the beginning of the system so that they can reuse some of those nutrients and certainly reuse the water to bring up their water efficiency. So the next category is waste that I wanted to touch on. The two main waste streams are plant waste and packaging waste. And John touched on the solutions to both a little bit, but I'll just elaborate some more. So with the plant waste, especially with marijuana waste, a very common policy requirement is that all marijuana waste must be mixed with 50% non-marijuana waste before leaving a licensed facility. The intent of this regulation was focused on safety, security, no illicit market diversion. Essentially, we didn't want people diving into dumpsters to steal these marijuana products or have it go to the illicit market. So it had to be mixed and ground up. What essentially it did is it doubles our landfill footprint, and it essentially mandates landfilling. It's pretty hard to find a 50% organic mix to mix with all of your plant waste in order to be able to compost it. We really saw this as a problem in Colorado. And so, I talked about some policy changes. I helped initiate some policy changes in Colorado that took effect in 2020. This is one of them. We said that the low THC components of the plant, the stalks, the stems, the fan leaves, the root balls, which is about 90% of the waste stream. The buds and the sugar leaves are why we're growing the plant. That's our commodity. That's our product. We don't throw it away. So those low THC components of the plant are exempt from that 50-50 waste mixing and rendering because there's no THC or cannabinoid value to them. We now allow that to go directly to composting without any of this 50-50 mixing. So it really reduces the waste footprint from the plant waste at the facilities. And we're actively encouraging other states to make similar considerations and allow for more direct composting of plant waste or other avenues like anaerobic digestion. The benefit of that is it's essentially composting in a closed environment, and you can capture the commodity gases that are coming off of it, the methane, the CO2, and utilize those commodities rather than just having them off gas like they do in a compost pile or in a landfill. At least when we compost, we get that nutrient benefit back, and that's better than at least landfilling. Then the consumer packaging waste, the biggest problem is there's a lot of it. It's hard to recycle. Even if it does make it into the recycling bin through a responsible consumer, oftentimes when it gets to the recycling facility, it cannot be sorted because it's too small. It's just, the recycling facilities are not designed for this type of small little plastic waste like joint tubes and the smaller drams that they sell eighths in that kind of look like old film tubes or I guess medication bottles as well. And so in Colorado, our solution to that was to legalize take-back programs, packaging take-back programs. Prior to us making this regulatory change, no outside product could enter the facility. And so there was this risk of trace amounts of product in vape cartridges or in the packaging. There'd be trace amounts of marijuana, and then the business would be in violation. We essentially removed that fear and said if the intent is recycling, you can do take-back programs and collection of waste. And then also our traditional recyclers, like our e-waste recyclers and our plastic recyclers, we said you do not have to have a special marijuana license to handle trace amounts of product if the intent is recycling. Because there was a lot of fear from our especially our e-waste recyclers. They did not want to take like cannabis vape cartridges because of trace amounts of product and worrying about not having a handling license. So we said you can handle that waste and you can recycle it. The stores that do the packaging take back programs, they have two options to handle that waste. They can either bulk recycle it, so it's already collected. It doesn't have to be sorted at the recycling facility. It can just be bulk recycled, which makes it a lot easier. Or it can go to reuse, which is really exciting. I'm hoping to start see more reusable packaging in the cannabis industry. This is something that's very popular in the brewing industry. Everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with the concept of a growler. Those are the big glass containers that you take home from the brewery, you can consume, and then you bring it back, and you typically get a discount for bringing it back and getting it refilled. I think there's a lot of opportunity for reusable, refillable packaging with the cannabis industry. And I think it creates opportunity for brand loyalty and differentiation in a very saturated market, like here in Colorado, where we have a dispensary on every corner. What's going to make me choose to shop at one versus another? If I have a branded reusable package, maybe from one, you can create that consumer loyalty while also reducing your packaging waste. I think John hit the nail on the head that there's a large untapped opportunity in the cannabis industry for industrial fiber use, not only from hemp, but from marijuana as well. Cannabis fibers are very long, they're very strong. They can do a lot, from building insulation to textiles to papers to oils to plastics. I mean, it's a very universal crop. The largest problem that I see right now is we don't have an industrial infrastructure for processing it right now. We have a ton of plant waste and we don't have a lot of factories to turn it into usable goods. And so I feel like it's an untapped market. We need that industrial market to come along and start utilizing all this waste fibers that we have from both hemp and from marijuana. All right, I'm almost done. I've got air left. So air quality. It's primarily the odors that people notice from cannabis. Cannabis has a very unique, distinct odor profile, and a lot of consumer complaints and community complaints that are related to the industry are really centered around odor. Because this odor is so intense, it's like the fear of the unknown. Is this odor harmful? Or is it just a nuisance? I actually led an air research study, which is linked on that the website that I dropped in the chat as well, that to quantify what is the air pollution profile coming from cannabis plants and how does it interact with our air shed, and is it harmful? And so what I did is, as the plants grow, they emit terpenes. Terpenes are volatile organic compounds, or VOCs for short. The reason why we care about VOCs is because they create they contribute to a secondary reaction in our atmosphere when they come into contact with nitrogen oxide emissions. That's going to be anything from combustion. So cars, power plants, wood burning, anytime we're doing burning anything, we get nitrogen oxide. So when nitrogen oxide and VOCs react in the atmosphere, they form ground level ozone, which is toxic for us to breathe. In Colorado, that's our #1 air quality pollutant of concern. And so the question was posed, 70% of our cannabis is grown in our urban Denver environment. That's our NOx-rich environment. We have a lot of cars, power plants, combustion activities. How much is the cannabis industry influencing ozone formation, if at all? So I did a research study to quantify pounds of VOCs coming off of per pound of marijuana grown, and then what's the overall influence on ozone. That study is published in Air and Waste Management Journal, but essentially what I found is it's not a pollutant. The VOCs are extremely low. We found about 10 pounds of VOCs per ton of marijuana grown. That's 10 pounds per 2,000 pounds of marijuana. To give you a relative scale on VOCs, a gallon of paint has about 8 pounds of VOCs in it. 1 gallon of paint has 8 pounds of VOCs in it, versus 2,000 pounds of marijuana is only emitting 10 pounds of VOCs. So very, very low. And because of the low emission rate, and the type of terpene is also very low on the reactivity scale for ozone formation, we found no influence on ozone. The percent increase was like 0.3 zeros deep and then a 9. I mean, essentially negligible. Our model had more noise in it than this VOC emissions. So what that tells us is that it is a nuisance odor that's coming off these facilities. It's not a public health threat. It's not an environmental threat. It's like, do you like the smell of pine trees or not? Do you like the smell of cannabis or not? Which I believe can drive good policy, and that a lot of odor control is done through carbon filtration. It takes a lot more energy to pull air through a carbon filter than it does an open HVAC duct. So if you're just controlling a nuisance odor versus a pollutant, you need to weigh that with the energy impacts of what you're actually doing. One last exciting thing I'm going to touch on before I pass it off to Buzz to talk about some exciting things that cross over with the wine industry. Was a partnership I formed with the brewing industry. In this synthetic indoor environment, oftentimes we have to feed in supplemental CO2 to the plants because they need to perform photosynthesis in an accelerated rate. When we bring cannabis crops indoors, we're condensing their lifespan from about 5 to as long as 9 months in an outdoor environment down to about 2 to 3 months in an indoor environment, and the plants grow just as big. So they need more light, they need more nutrients, they need more CO2 in order to perform that photosynthesis. So we feed in supplemental CO2. Otherwise, we're not being energy efficient because we're overloading them with lights and not giving them enough CO2 to actually utilize that light. So CO2 also has an impact on energy use. But what we did is we worked with a local brewery because the last stage in brewing beer, fermentation, generates a lot of CO2, like a lot of CO2, way more than what you would expect. And breweries typically just vent that to atmosphere. So instead of venting to atmosphere, we captured it for their own in-house CO2 use when they're carbonating and packaging the beer, and then also sold the excess to a local marijuana cultivation for a local source of that supplemental CO2 to create this closed loop CO2 economy where what would be wasted from the brewery and emitted to atmosphere is now being essentially fed to the plants in an unofficial term. Photosynthesis is not eating, but essentially, creating this closed loop economy for what would typically be a waste stream. So that's all I had. Let me know if you guys have questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. With that, I'll hand it over to Buzz.
Great. Thanks, Chandler. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, John. I will state the obvious. The great thing about being a panelist on a program like this is engaging with folks that you don't know, like John and Caitlin, but you can learn so much from. So I really appreciate the context. I dropped, Caitlin, I put the link to the 2020 report that you mentioned in the chat, and I commend everybody to take a look at that. And there's an interesting kind of overlap with John's comments and with one of the very first things in the executive summary, which talks about the importance of displacing the illegal market. And, I think from an environmental law perspective, and in terms of some of the pragmatic stuff that, I and myself and my colleagues at Farella, Braun and Martelli engage in, both in our San Francisco office and in our wine country office, is really the element of regulation. And I was struck, John, by your slide that shows the extent and the amount of money involved across the world. And it really, in contrast, the degree to which the cannabis industry is legalized and regulated. And there's a huge distinction there. And I think that really goes to, part of what California and Colorado too, but California in the context of our work as environmental lawyers has been very focused on displacing the illegal market because of the harm to the environment that it has caused over time. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that just sort of build off of what John and Caitlin talked about. And part of that has to do with really a move, not a significant move, but an element in California that complements the indoor grow industry, which is the outdoor grow industry. And I had an opportunity to be on a panel several months ago with a Southern California farmer, longstanding family operation that determined or decided that they were going to convert some of their row crops to cannabis. And the amount of acreage that they were converting was around 80 to 100 acres. So this was a large scale operation. And that process from a permitting and a county use permit perspective took about 2 years. So, not an insignificant effort and a fairly lengthy effort over the course of time. And some of the issues that Caitlin's mentioned and that John touched on as well were very prevalent in the context of permitting that new use for that agricultural land. And some of it had to do with terpenes and the concern over the odors and the concern over the taint on other crops because other crops were being grown nearby. There were some mitigation measures that were put into place, like, you know, fast growing trees and setbacks and things like that. But those are issues that outdoor growing operations are going to continue to have to deal with. And, you know, certainly in California, there can be nuisance complaints associated with odor, which can sometimes be a problem, even though there may not be a scientific or a credible basis associated with, you know, damage associated with that, those terpenes or those odors. You know, the other thing is just in terms of some of those growing operations, they may be proximate to residential areas. Typically, they're going to be in areas that are zoned agricultural and such. We have a large wine country practice, as Caitlin touched on, in Napa and Sonoma that we do out of our wine country office in Santa Elena and also out of our San Francisco office. And we're not really seeing conversion of wine and vineyards to cannabis in that context. But I think in other parts of the state, we are seeing that more and more. And so in terms of some of the best practices and talking about impacts and such, I just want to touch on a couple of quick issues in the time that we have. You know, obviously there still exists a fair degree of cultivation using greenhouses, and, you know, the wastewater associated from greenhouses, which is typically called irrigation tailwater, it's rejection water, sometimes from reverse osmosis systems, and it can be high in nitrates, high in TDS. And, you know, the recovery associated with some of that tailwater can be challenging. And so the discharges from those permits in the state of California do require what's called a waste discharge requirement permit. Those are basically similar to an MPDS permit in the context of our state structure. And so those things need to be permitted, but there's also some wastewater alternatives that have been developed in terms of best management practices. You know, reuse is something that is much sought after, but there are some liability concerns if, you know, some of the reuse of that water might be used as irrigation on edible crops. There's RO treatment systems, which can still be expensive and still have waste streams. Off-site disposal is obviously expensive and can generate traffic, and traffic can be a concern in the context of the use permits, where you may have to go through California Environmental Quality Act process or a county use permit process, and traffic is obviously a very large concern. There's also blending and evaporation ponds and things like that. And then there's also bioreactors. And one of the bioreactors that has really started to come into favor are wood chip bioreactors, which are fairly elemental, where there's a, you know, subsurface pit that's dug. A lot of contractors are familiar with doing these types of bioreactor installations in other settings and contexts, not just in the state of California, but really across the US. Relatively low cost, linear design. It's a proven technology for nitrate reduction. So the regulatory acceptance of wood chip bioreactors is sort of coming along. There's a Central Coast Regional Board order that has recognized a waiver associated with those. And it is something that I think is really beneficial to the industry in terms of reducing some of the waste streams. John mentioned surface water, and notwithstanding and Caitlin too, notwithstanding what I would call the minuscule use of water compared to other crops and other facility uses of water, the water supply is still a key issue, whether you're growing inside or outside. And surface water is going to be seasonal. It can be a problem sometimes to draw from a nearby stream if it's not fully appropriated, or if you don't have riparian rights. It's not drought resilient. And in the state of California, we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, which was put into place several years ago. And groundwater uses used to be largely unregulated in the state of California, but now you have to assess sustainable yield. You have to ensure beneficial use and avoid adverse impacts. And that's a planning process too, at both the local and the state level. So those are some of the issues, just, kind of quickly to touch on, that I think are, contextualized by what John and Caitlin talked about, and that we're going to see, I think, more and more in the context of potential conversion of row crops to cannabis crops, and that really touch on some of the issues that that John and Caitlin talked about. I think energy use, certainly in the indoor growing space, is going to continue to be a huge issue, and one that folks are going to have to think creatively about and look to alternative uses, battery power, and a number of things that I think each of our states and really across the globe, folks are very focused on in terms of alternative energy supplies and things of that sort. So we're sort of up against the clock. Chandler, I don't know if you want to open it up for questions. I saw a couple in the chat, and maybe we can have a bit of a discussion as we wrap this up.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have about half an hour left. And I do see a couple of questions in the chat, and I think we can start with this one here. Caitlin, I'll toss it to you first, but we can definitely have, I definitely encourage John and Buzz, to provide your input as well. The question asks, to what extent is cannabis packaging more wasteful compared to similar products like vapes, cigarettes, or medicine?
So I think the important thing here is to understand the child resistant requirements, which isn't a requirement for the vapes and cigarettes traditionally, but it is for marijuana products. It's also a requirement for medicine. I think it's unique that marijuana walks in both realms of recreational, considered similar to alcohol and cigarettes, but then also walks in, medical use as well. There's a lot of medical use application. Some states have only even legalized for medical purposes. And so there's a distinction there. And then just also too, that I think that the regulations are getting a little bit smarter around the layers of packaging that's required. So we can have a child resistant container and keep it small and keep the labeling requirements reasonable, so that, like what John mentioned before, sometimes the labeling requirements can get so enormous that you have to create a bigger package just to be able to put the label on. And so making sure that that's streamlined so that we can keep these containers, small. And then also, like I mentioned before, I think there's opportunity to work through a reuse model as well. Which there was a question in the chat about sterilization. Absolutely, sterilization is part of that reuse requirement. There's also a reuse requirement for inspection for good working order of that child resistant piece of the package. There has been a trend where folks are just doing reusable package, like so a glass jar, and then you get a new child resistant plastic top each time it goes to reuse. So you're only sanitizing the bottom, and then you get a new child resistant top each time. So it's hard to make those comparative processes. Oh, I see. Licenses are not. Oh, I didn't understand. Okay, so I think I answered it, but Buzz and John, if you have more thoughts.
John, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, maybe I'll just pick up on the point that Telesport is making, that the operators themselves don't want to have to be the ones to manage this process. And I think that's entirely fair. It's difficult enough to run a cannabis business operation without having to add on this fairly significant component that's going to have pretty strict regulations around what allows a product to be reused in the sales stream. But to me, this is one of the myriad opportunities for a ancillary market service or ancillary service for this market. My expectation, Telesport, would not be that the retailers themselves are the ones in the back scrubbing these jars clean. On a scale size, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and on efficiencies, from an efficiency standpoint, to me, the opportunity would be for somebody to be going through all of the dispensaries in town, collecting their semi-standardized products, and then getting them back into the appropriate retail channels. one of the things that we have observed as this industry has matured is this idea of specialization. So, when this market first started out, a lot of businesses were trying to do all things. But as you see in every other sector of the mature economy, companies take on very specialized roles in serving the supply chain and ensuring efficient operations. And so this idea of recyclability, I think, is something that will likely end up being managed by third-party vendors who are serving multiple operators. And hopefully that will lead to a couple of things. One, greater standardization. I think there's part of the reason why so much waste is being generated at a micro scale is because everybody's using their own sizes, their own dimensions, their own types of packages. And so if we start cohering to or converging towards some standard sizes, standard models of operation, then that will certainly help with the back end recyclability. But also too, I don't see a lot of utility in this being something that each individual retailer takes on. Maybe if the MSOs grew to the scale of 7-Eleven, where they're driving such massive volumes that it does make sense for them to do this for themselves, that might be one angle. But for most mom and pops, there's just not going to be a lot of utility to do this themselves.
John, you raised some good points. Caitlin, you too. I was just reflecting on sort of the food industry, and one of the things about the pandemic is that we've all been going to some of our favorite restaurants and taking food out. Right now, that's not analogous to the cannabis industry because of the need for child-proof packaging and other things. But one of the things that I think we've all seen in our local communities is, consumers can make a choice sometimes, and that can be offered by the retailer, which is to say that, if you go to your neighborhood restaurant, one in particular that we like in Oakland, they have a program where you pay a little bit more for a compostable, disposable container. But if you purchase the product, or if you purchase the food, and you have a container that can be returned to them, rinsed out, and then I believe that a third party, actually they hire that third party sanitizes and brings it back to the restaurant. That's a nice reuse model. Now, I don't know, again, if that has high application in the cannabis industry because of the differences in terms of, serving food and selling cannabis. But it struck me as we were talking about that, I think there are things that can be consumer driven and can be retailer driven as well that can help with those kind of recycling and reuse markets.
I was just going to throw out, based on your food example, that there are certain areas in New York that have banned to-go containers, like single-use to-go containers for food. And so there's like these third-party operators that have popped up that have reusable containers. You essentially pay a deposit, they sanitize, reuse, and then give it back to all the restaurants. And so it's almost like a regional solution where it's feeding multiple restaurants. There's multiple drop-off points. And then, there's one sanitization and sterilization and then redistribution point.
Just maybe a quick add-on point around child-proof packaging, which is a little bit provocative, because I know for a lot of particularly more conservative policymakers, the idea of not having cannabis be child-proof is a non-starter. So part of the reason why a lot of these rules were put in place were parts of the compromise to promulgate these regulations to get it done. But if you think about two sectors which cannabis is most often kind of analogized to, tobacco and alcohol, we don't have child-proof packaging for cigarettes. We don't have child-proof packaging for most alcohol products. Maybe in some neighborhoods you'll have some theft-proof things in your liquor store, but that's about it. And so, we understand that as a society, we're still making this transition to accepting cannabis as another regulated intoxicant in our society. And there's a lot of stigma that still continues to influence and shape our public policy making. But if we think about it, when was the last time we heard about a story about child's accidental ingestion of a pack of cigarettes, or it just doesn't happen because it doesn't have the same kind of appeal. So there are some product types that may be better suited for child-proof packaging. Edibles in particular, I think, are one area where maintaining that limited access is important. But most children are not going to look at a joint and think, oh, I want to stick that in my mouth, it looks delicious. Or a cannabis plant. It generally doesn't work that way. And so, I think there is a lot of room for greater pragmatism about where the risk lies, and creating regulations that are a little more scalpel-like rather than chainsaw, in terms of ensuring that in the areas where there is real risk of exposure, particularly to minors, that it is being mitigated without creating rules that are so broad that they end up creating a very, very significant and intractable downstream waste.
I was just going to add too that not only is flower not attractive to children, the direct ingestion exposure, THC has to be heat activated in order for it to become psychoactive. And so ingesting flower, a child ingesting flower, is essentially, it's not going to get them high. It's not going to have that negative psychological effect. And it's interesting that all heat elements that would be used to heat activate that marijuana are child resistant up to age like 8. And child resistant packaging for marijuana is only restricted up to age 5. So I think that's interesting from a policy standpoint.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for that discussion around that question. I think those are some really interesting points that were raised. I see one question here about barriers to entry, but first, I just want to ask you all a question about data. One of the things that we've talked about, and I know several of you touched on during your remarks, is how difficult it is to acquire data. So how difficult is it? Why is it difficult? And how accurate is the data that we do have? And John, maybe I'll start with you for this, and then anyone who'd like to jump in, please feel free to do so.
So, I've been a market research analyst and consultant my entire career, and it was very interesting coming in from other sectors of the economy, everything from technology, government, healthcare, financial services, where the problem was always too much data. Like, we just always had more data than we knew what to do with. And then coming into the industry nearly 8 years ago and finding nothing. It has changed. The industry has evolved, and there's certainly a lot more data now than we've ever had access to. I'd like to commend Caitlin and the entire team in Colorado, just because Colorado, I think, has done a phenomenal job in creating reporting structures that give us visibility into what's happening in industry statewide, and certainly encourage other states to follow that model. It's difficult. One of the reasons why data has become more readily accessible are a lot of these state regulations that require tracking, whether it's seed to sale tracking or point of sale system data tracking, that have enabled over time the ability to start getting better visibility, better insights into this market. So, for example, at New Frontier Data, we now have point of sale data from about 25 legal regulated markets in the US, which is, we've finally broken through that big data threshold. We're finally starting to look like a real retail environment. So at least on the retail side, the data collection component has actually gotten quite good, and we've become very comfortable with the amount of volume of data we're getting there, and its precision. But it's on some of these supply chain operational side that the challenges remain. Simply because the historically, cannabis producers have been some of the cagiest people on the planet. Data collection protocols have not been the most robust, and getting them to share their data has also been a major challenge. So it remains a challenge. For the 2 studies we've done on water and on energy, I mean, we had to beg, borrow, and do everything short of steal to get stakeholders to provide us their data on what they were using in their operations. Some of it is, if it's not required, why am I adding work to my plate? Some of it is, is this data going to be used against me? And I'm worried about that. But the industry is coming around. I've been heartened by some of the public-private partnerships that are being built, and I think Caitlin has spoken really beautifully to the type of research that the government is able to do in partnership with private sector operators. I think the industry is realizing the utility in learning what's working well and what's not working. This market is getting so competitive that some of this comparative data is becoming really useful in helping everyone elevate their performance. But the reality is this industry does still have a long way to go. I'm heartened by the role that technology is now playing in most of the supply chain, from cultivation to processing. And the more you integrate technological systems, the more data you have being generated, and that data then can become made accessible more broadly. But it remains a challenge outside of the retail sector, and we're working furiously to try and gain access to as much of it as we can, because to have these kinds of conversations, it's really easy to point a lot of fingers at this industry, but we find that once you have real data to inform some of these perspectives, then it really challenges a lot of the assumptions that are driving the way this market is being regulated.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate that answer, and I think that's really helpful to keep in mind. Get to this question here in the chat. Person writes, environmental groups need to put pressure on regulatory bodies to lower the barrier of entry. High taxes and fees are creating an illicit market that really hurts the environment. But in the cannabis market, the bottom line is extraordinarily important for the consumer as well as the producer. I don't know if I'll just throw this out to the group and see who wants to answer. And maybe just what are your reactions to their points, and what are you seeing in terms of barriers to entry? Is that a factor, or what are some of the other issues that you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I'll go first, Chandler. I mean, that's a very complicated issue in California and elsewhere. I mean, California has a longstanding history of illicit cannabis cultivation, and John, to your point about data collection, I think Caitlin and I both smiled when you made that comment about the folks within the industry can be reluctant to share information. And that can be, sometimes that has nothing to do with just being suspicious. It can be a business advantage too. To the point of the question, I think one of the issues that we all face, and Caitlin and I, we talked about Colorado really, I think, trying to eliminate those licensing and permitting barriers as much as possible. I think that's really key. The difficulty in any state, and I would say in California perhaps in particular, is that there can be contrary views about the appropriateness of a grow operation in your community. There can be particular views about a cannabis retailer locating in a particular spot where it used to be a restaurant or something like that. And those can be complicated and difficult issues. And in a litigious environment, you can have lawsuits really on both ends, where project proponents who wish to proceed with a growing operation or a retail operation, they'll check all the boxes. They'll go through CEQA. They'll comply with county use requirements, and those reports and that aspect of the project will be something that's approved, and yet there may be a claim and litigation filed that challenges that. And the same can be true on the other side of the equation, where those barriers can create a real disadvantage from a business perspective to those cannabis operations that want to operate legally. So I don't have a solution. I recognize the problem, and I think that I think the work that John's doing, the work that Caitlin's doing, and the work that a lot of the state regulators in California are doing is going to help that process. but we're not there yet. We're always going to have that tension, really kind of on both sides of the equation, you know, project proponents, project opponents. And again, no easy answer, but those are, it's an issue that's very prevalent, I think, in the context of the marketplace.
I have some support for that. It's maybe unpopular stance, but I mean, at least here in Colorado, being a little bit more of a mature market, especially on the recreational side, what we've seen is really economic drivers tamping out the illicit market. We almost see it going the opposite direction, that our legal market actors are getting so efficient, and there's so much competition that it's essentially a race to the bottom on price. You know, it's very typical here to find, you know, prices on an ounce of marijuana to be around $100. In many other markets, it's, you know, $400, $500. Colorado, it's gotten to the point where it's so price competitive that our illicit market actors are tamped out. They cannot grow an ounce and sell it for $100. And they certainly can't do that in a clean, compliant store where a retail consumer rather shop if it's price comparative.
So I'd love to riff on just kind of 2 points there. One on Caitlin's point about the efficiency of the legal market once it gains steam. You know, most consumers don't want or will not want to go back to the illicit market once they've had access to the legal market. They're not willing to pay 100% more than they were in the illicit market, but they will need to pay a little more for the advantages of being able to shop in the legal market, being able to shop in daylight, in sunlight, you know, without having to deal with the sketchy guy in the corner of the black alley who's putting random stuff from underneath his bed. They want the quality, the testing, the product selection, the value-added products. They're willing to pay premium for that, but it has to be within reason. One of the challenges I think we see in California is this tremendous taxation that the state has put on cannabis, where once you combine state taxes, municipal taxes, and excise taxes, in some jurisdictions, in some counties in California, you're paying nearly 50% in taxes out the door. Consumers, it just doesn't make sense for most consumers to pay that much, particularly in a market like California, where there's such widely abundant, high quality cannabis available in the illicit market. And so we tend to caution policymakers from viewing cannabis as a cash cow, because the higher you place the taxes on the product, then the slower the transition it will be for consumers to come from the illicit market into the legal market. It will ultimately happen because the market will get very efficient. And so market's efficiency will offset that high taxation rate. It just takes much longer to get there. Colorado, I think, is a great example of a market where they found the right balance in taxes. They had a pretty open licensing process, and the market got real smart, real competitive, real quick. And which is why now the majority of the demand in Colorado is being served by the legal market. But a second point around taxation that is worth noting is the role that federal taxes are playing on impeding reinvestment in innovation in cannabis. So because of a quirk in federal law, cannabis businesses are not allowed to deduct, because cannabis remains illegal under federal law, cannabis businesses are not allowed to deduct their ordinary necessary business expenses like you can in every other business in the economy. So it's under IRS code 280E. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of it. Bottom line is that most sectors of the economy, your business taxes are coming in around 26%, maybe up to 30%. Cannabis businesses, because they can't make these deductions, are paying upwards of 75, 80, 85% in taxes. That has a huge impact on the ability to make reinvestments, to focus on R&D, to focus on innovation, because Uncle Sam is getting that money. And so we think that, you know, the federal taxation reform in particular, whatever shape that ultimately takes, just normalizing the taxation of cannabis businesses at the federal level will have a huge role in both cannabis business profitability, but the ability to invest in some of these innovations that we've been slow to get to because cannabis remains illegal under federal law.
thank you so much for bringing that up, John. That's I recognize we have about 8 minutes left on the program, but I decided to throw the biggest question and maybe the hardest question to answer at all of you for the end. So we've danced around it a little bit, and John, you just touched on it, is that cannabis remains illegal at the federal level. But how might federal legalization affect at least environmental sustainability in the cannabis industry? And you can feel free to expand beyond environmental sustainability just to give us a sense of how legalization at the federal level would change the industry overall. But I'll throw that out to whoever wants to start, and then hope to piggyback around.
Well, I'll start just on an elemental basis. I know that it's incredibly challenging from a banking perspective. And, John, you raised the tax issues, and I think those are key in terms of reform as well. But the contrast between the fact that it's illegal as a federal matter, and that states, many of them are moving towards legalization, it just creates, I think, huge hurdles and huge challenges for the industry, and it is an industry. I mean, as John aptly pointed out, I mean, it's a huge industry, and so I think the implications of federal laws are huge, and you can, Caitlin and John, you can pick up on my remarks. I mean, this is a really obvious one, but I just think about my corporate partners and colleagues in our cannabis practice group, and some of the stories in terms of just how acquisitions are done and mergers are done. It's to say that they're challenging and frankly a little bit weird and strange is just a complete understatement. So the Department of Justice has had a pretty much non-prosecutorial stance with respect to things. That doesn't mean that those illegal operations are not subject to enforcement. They're certainly subject to enforcement on a statewide basis. And I think, in terms of some of the colloquy we had on some of the prior questions, that's a tremendously important impediment to illegal growing, is the risk of enforcement. And, we are seeing that more in California. But I think if the federal government could see its way to pass some cannabis-friendly legislation, it would be very welcome.
A great point, Buzz. And maybe I would just add, as a point of distinction, that we actually don't think that the federal government is going to legalize cannabis. We think it's going to deschedule it, which would make it a state's issue. And perpetuate some of this patchwork nation issue that Buzz has been commenting on. So yes, under a descheduled model, and looking at the bills that have been proposed both by Chuck Schumer on the left and Nancy Mace on the right, there are going to be some kind of stock elements that feature in what a national regulatory framework is going to look like. There's going to be an excise tax. What that tax is going to be, the amount is still being debated. There's going to be investment in medical cannabis. There's going to be some kind of standards required, likely under the FDA, which is going to introduce a new degree of complexity here. We don't know what that ultimately looks like, but we assume that there's going to be some national standards for cannabis product quality control that may begin as advisory and then transition to being mandated. But what we think is unlikely is that the federal government will say it is now nationally legal at the federal level, and the federal government is going to then assume the burden of nationally regulating this plant. I think just given what remains is a pretty significant national divide on attitudes around cannabis, means that the policymakers, lawmakers will want to perpetuate or at least maintain the ability for states to have some autonomy in their decision making on how this plant is regulated.
The only thing I have to add in part of the federal legalization conversation is that I do hope that they consider the environment and the impacts in whatever framework comes out of it. But then also too, just highlighting that states are always allowed to be more stringent than federal. And so states like Colorado and California that already have legal structures for marijuana, with that decriminalization, their regulations will stand because they can always be more stringent than the federal. And so I think really where we're going to see the struggle and the downside, a lot of the downside issues are in states that do not have marijuana legal structure already, and all of a sudden it's decriminalized essentially in their state. And so it creates a lot of room for gray area market where people are kind of allowed but not really allowed, and the state doesn't have a structure yet. And then you just have essentially a market without testing, a market without inspections, and all kinds of different things. So I almost feel like states that have previously legalized and have a regulatory structure in place are better suited to face federal legalization than states that have not.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for your answers. I recognize we are just about out of time, but maybe for these last couple minutes, if each of you could spend 30 seconds just with any last remarks that you'd like to leave with us. So Caitlin, I can start with you, and then we can go in the order that, and then John, and then Buzz.
I would just say final thoughts are that this is an emergent market. It's constantly evolving. I think having the openness to look at maybe there's a different or better way to do things is something that we all need to keep in mind. And then as we create these policy and regulatory structures, we really need to have a pulse on, are things working? Having new frontier data, for instance, be able to provide data backing that, cannabis water use isn't as maybe as high as people are perceiving it to be, to have those data checks to say, is our regulatory structure working, or are we doubling our landfill footprint inadvertently by requiring cannabis waste to be mixed with 50% non-cannabis waste with the intent of no illicit market diversion and creating essentially an environmental disaster? We need to stay nimble and flexible and willing to address these challenges of tomorrow. And then just a final thought too on federal legalization. With that is going to come a market evolution of economies of scale that has happened in any other agricultural sector. There's a reason that Colorado does not grow oranges and almonds. Pretty good reason why we grow it in California. I think that in these pockets of legalization and markets evolving, and as I mentioned, the race to the bottom on prices, that's only going to be amplified on a macro economic scale when we get federal legalization and interstate commerce. Colorado may not be the hub of marijuana distribution in the future.
Great point. And maybe I'll riff off of that, Caitlin, and say a couple of things. One, despite all of the growth, excitement, animation that we've seen around legal cannabis over the past handful of years, worth remembering that both on a national basis and on a global basis, we've barely scratched the tip of this iceberg. We are still I don't play baseball, but we're still very, very in early innings on what is going to be a very, very long game here. And so for those who may be observing this industry as a high opportunity market, but wondering if you've missed the boat, you haven't. We think that this is going to continue to be a very, very opportunity rich market well into the next decade. More competitive, more innovative, and more solutions oriented in a way that we haven't seen to date, but certainly very, very opportunity rich. Second, for anyone who is studying this space, we very strongly urge to look at where the market is going, not where it currently is. Caitlin talked about the downward price pressure for flower. We saw a question here from Adam, and Colorado's wholesale flower prices have fallen, last I checked, 47% since the highs of 2015. At one point, they were down 63% since the highs of 2015. So if you were building a cannabis facility, assuming that you could be able to get $2,000 a pound when your facility was active, and by the time your operational cannabis was selling at $800 a pound, you'd be in deep trouble. So, be very, very aggressive in operational efficiency, and every incremental gain does have an impact on the bottom line. And given how large this industry is growing, how competitive it's becoming, critically important to bear the imperative of resource efficiency as you think about these operations. And then third, to Caitlin's point, worth remembering that cannabis is a plant and most plants do really well outdoors. And so as we transition from this being a US-centric conversation to a global conversation, at some point we will start to see the locuses of production move to the places in the world where you've got plenty of sunlight, great outdoor growing conditions, and you can produce it at massive scale for relatively low cost, at least for some applications. There is still going to be demand for really highly curated, indoor produced, beautiful in the jar flower products, and the connoisseurs are still going to want that. But as we start thinking about the value added products who are looking for either just cannabinoids or for processed oils, then there's really not that requirement, same need for that level of curation. And so start looking at markets like Latin America, parts of Africa, parts of Asia like Thailand, where they are planning mega facilities that with the idea of being producers for the world. And so, figure out where in this continuum of highly specialized indoor resource intensive production versus massive agricultural scale production of outdoor for oils and cannabinoid extraction, where along that continuum one wants to sit, and then plan accordingly for the evolution of this global market that is coming.
I don't have too much to add to anything that John or Caitlin have said, except to echo it. And I think Chandler, sort of to the point of this whole program, I think programs that ELI can put on like this and other providers can put on like this. I mean, we share knowledge, we share information. There's a degree of transparency associated with these kinds of discussions. And, I think consistent with a lot of the points that have been raised today, there's a lot that technology can offer us in terms of improvements and scaling, and it's just a very interesting and evolving marketplace. And I think John's statement is one that we can probably all kind of take home, which is that we're very early on in this, and to use the baseball analogy, it has to be fluid, and the rules may change too, as we see with baseball. I mean, the baseball that was played several years ago is not exactly how it's being played right now, just based on, analytics, extra innings, a man on second base, and so on and so forth. So, Chandler, thank you for getting us together, and John and Caitlin, I've really enjoyed doing this with you, and hopefully the panel has had some good takeaways as well, or the participants.
Well, thank you all so much. I definitely have taken a lot away from this program. I've learned a lot and just really appreciate each of your contributions to this program. Just want to say thank you so much to our audience for joining us today and for your many thought-provoking questions. We hope you continue to watch the space in the years ahead, and an enormous thank you to our panelists. We just so appreciate all of your contributions to today's program. Thank you all so much. Please take care and stay safe, and I hope we can do something like this together soon. Thank you all.
All right, thank you.
Thanks very much. Lovely.